This is an evasion of ministerial responsibility on a matter of public policy. Now, of course, we've discussed so much the conduct of ministers, we've somewhat forgotten that this whole story is part of a very unhappy record of British relations in the Middle East, which my honourable friend is going to raise again on Friday. Iraq was part of the world we took over when the Ottoman Empire disappeared. Britain bombed Iraq with chemical weapons in the 1920s, and a few months ago the Queen Mother put up a statue to the man who did it. Bomber Harris was the squadron leader who used chemical weapons against Iraq. We planned to occupy Kuwait in 1958, and it all came out with the papers when Selwyn Lloyd wrote to Foster Dulles and said, we might take over Kuwait as a crown colony. And the double standards of British policy in the Middle East is the thing that will be noticed by anyone in the Arab world who reads this debate. We didn't take the view we did about Kuwait when Turkey invaded Cyprus, when the occupied territories were taken over by Israel. This Gulf War, looked at in the light of what we now know, was a war for profit, a war for oil, and a war for the control of the area. And now we are suddenly told that ministers who protested so vigorously about their defence of democracy and human rights were selling weapons to Saddam Hussein, who was repressing Kurds and Shiites before and after the war, and then saying it was just a question of flexible guidelines. 200,000 Iraqis were killed last year by forces including our own. 150,000 Iraqi babies under 5 were expected to die by the Harvard medical team that looked at the bombing of the water supply by British, American and French bombers. And it is an act of odious hypocrisy then to come along, as honourable members have said, and say, but of course our industry needs the orders, people want the jobs. You remember the joke about the man producing nuclear weapons in America, and somebody said, how could you do it? And he said, well, the man's got to live, hasn't he? And that is the argument, that somehow you can justify the supply of weapons in that way. The international arms trade is a greater threat to world peace than the AIDS epidemic or the drugs trade because it's supported by governments. It props up dictators, the Shah, Batista, Marcos, Papadoc, all these people, Pinochet, props them up, and they get the weapons to crush their own people in the interests of keeping down their own people so that the multinationals can make a profit from the superpowers that sell them the weapons. And then, because they bought the weapons, they get into trouble with the IMF, and the IMF comes along and says, cut your social budgets, because you've got to pay the debt on the arms you bought to keep down your own people. And, of course, the waste of skill. Some of the most brilliant scientists and engineers in the world are working on methods of death instead of the means of life. And billions and billions and billions of pounds are wasted on weapons that could have saved lives. And a heavy responsibility rests upon everybody, and I know every government to some extent has done it, who promotes the international arms trade. Because there have been 134 wars since 1945. Millions have died in them, using weapons that were supplied by the superpowers very often, and millions more died because they were denied the resources that were wasted in the arms program itself. Ministers will not tell the House the truth on this matter. Ministers use intelligence, and everybody knows it, we've had a reference to it, and are prepared to sacrifice intelligent people to conceal the truth. This is a matter the House should deal with by select committee. Look at Oliver North. They had him up before a congressional committee and they grilled him for weeks on it, on Watergate. When Peter Wright wrote a book saying he'd committed treason, they spent millions of pounds trying to prevent the book getting into the hands of the British people. Because the central question is, who is allowed to buy the weapons? Who controls it? Who knows what happens? Who tells the truth? And finally, does the House take the responsibility for holding government accountable? Or does it shuffle it off like so much else to a commission here, an agency there, or a High Court judge there? Because if it does that, we shall be burying this House as a historic defender of the rights of the people we represent, some of whom were sent to fight in Iraq against an army we had armed.